there, gang. We're going to do some fairly significant work to this guitar. It's one built by Augustino LoPrinzi, sometimes known to his friends as Augie. He's an interesting character from New Jersey, and he holds an important place in the history of small batch guitar manufacturing in the USA. Following the Second World War, the making of acoustic guitars became kind of monopolized. There were 3 or 4 big companies that made everything. The smaller makers that were there previously were either bought out or trod under, and the market became kind of uniform. You know, it was stratified into price points, but there really were, if you picked up a guitar, it probably had one of 4 names on it. LoPrinzi was in that first cohort of makers in the 60s and 70s to try and break out and revive the small shop thing. Others would be Michael Gurian, Stuart Mossman, Jean Larrivée, that kind of person. From the late 1950s, he was building classical and flamenco guitars in a room attached to his barber shop. He was a barber with the sideline as a guitar builder. And he got a bit of publicity and made a name for himself and decided he wanted to go into steel string guitar manufacture. So in 1972, he set up the LoPrinzi Guitar Company with his brother. They hired some people, they got really ambitious really quick, and they started making about 1,000 guitars a year. And of course, he quickly ran into the nightmare that happens every time someone tries this. You no longer get to build, and instead you have to deal with the sales staff all day and the paperwork and the lawyers. So 3 years later, he sold that company to a big corporation, and his brother stayed on there as the president, ostensibly to sign the labels, as Augie says. He immediately turned around and formed a new company called Augustino Guitars, after his first name rather than his last, where he could do a lot of the actual assembly himself with a smaller crew around him, and they still managed to build 400 guitars a year, which is not inconsiderable, but it was slightly more manageable. He did this right next door to his old company, in the building next door, because he refused to sign a non-compete clause when they were transferring it over. The corporation that bought him out, AMF, you may have heard of them before, they really didn't know what they were doing. This is the same company that ruined Harley-Davidson back in the 70s and 80s. It didn't go well for them. Eventually he managed to buy his own name back. I think it was like 5 years later or so. I'm leaning very heavily on an article from the Guild of American Luthiers by John Peterson. There was another one from John Calkin that describes some of the methods used by Augie, because John used to go over to the shop and hang around. Augie was self-taught based on looking at classical guitars, and he carried some of that methodology forward, including, apparently, sometimes at least, Spanish heel construction. We're going to see what happens with this because it needs a neck reset. And John had to do one once that ended up being a slip-the-back job. Some people have asked if they could see me do one of those, and I keep saying it's so rare, and I'm almost never presented with the opportunity. In a case like this, it would be really nice to have a portable x-ray machine at hand so I can find out how this neck is actually attached. So yeah, this is from a strange time in American guitar history where you have small shops beginning to surface, but there isn't a whole lot of standardization yet in terms of jigs and procedures. So there's a lot of variability. You know, externally this looks just like a D18 with maple back and sides, but inside, who knows? Let's get through the usual measurements here. The action height is 10.5, 11/64 on the bass side, which is like 4+ millimeters. And on the treble, 8/64, by 1/8 of an inch, which is like 3.1 millimeters. Yeah, so that's got to come down. On the bridge side of things, there's no room to maneuver here at all. There's like a 32nd of an inch exposed saddle on the treble side and less than a 1/16 on the bass. The top of the bridge itself has been planed off too, so its total height is only around 3/16 of an inch, which is almost half what it should be. So a bridge replacement seems in order. Neck relief is pretty substantial. It's around 17 thousandths at the 6th fret. Even with the low bridge height, a straight edge laid on top of the frets actually contacts the top of the soundboard. Ideally, it should of course come to the top surface of the bridge and maybe a little bit more. In this case, such a low bridge, it should be almost, 1/16 of an inch taller. So yeah, the geometry is all messed up. Even with the high action and the difficulty in playing, it's still a very nice sounding guitar. First hurdle. I want to straighten the neck before I begin work, but the truss rod nut is non-standard. It's actually a 3/8 inch connector bolt for all thread. I got out my mini ratchet, but unfortunately the socket was too long and it wouldn't clear the transverse brace, no matter how hard I swore. So out came the Dremel. Cut-off discs are wonderful. With the alterations done, I was able to effect a proper adjustment on the truss rod. Other things to say about this instrument. The back and sides are maple, flamed. The sides are really quite nice. The top, however, is, I don't know, we'd probably call it a B grade. The grain lines kind of diverge here at the butt end of the instrument, forming a V. They are irregular in width, and there are portions that seem quite far off the quarter. It's not perfectly quarter cut spruce. The neck is mahogany. It's got some gold-plated Grovers on there for tuners. The fingerboard is not even in thickness all the way along. It was probably dressed flat after being installed on the guitar because it's relatively narrow at the nut end, gets fairly thick as it reaches the body, and then thins out again over the extension. The other thing I've noticed is the fret slots are cut very deep. Really, you just want enough to house the fret tang, because anything more and you're decreasing the stiffness of the neck, you're making it less stable because you've basically cut a bunch of kerfs into it. In cases such as this, I like to install the new bridge before doing the reset, because it gives me something concrete to work with in terms of height. The old one came off with very little complaint. Got a nice old dark piece of rosewood on which I traced the outline. I transferred the string spacing and drilled the holes. The oscillating spindle sander makes pretty quick work of shaping things. There's always some refined shaping to do with the hand tools as well. And as always, quite a bit of sanding. Augie glued his bridges on properly, so I just have to score a pencil's breadth of lacquer around the outline and scrape that off. Then I'll sand the gluing area. Glued on the bridge, cleaned up the squeeze out. It doesn't look like much, but that extra 1/8 of an inch in height can make a huge difference to the quality of sound. I had to check something out, because John Culkin mentioned seeing employees thicknessing material by hand with sanding blocks because Augie contended that it was faster. At this point they seem to have had access to a wide belt sander. Thank goodness. We'll have a look at the interior. The bracing is very standard. I'm looking for two things here. The first is that there's an open space at the top of the neck block through which the end of the truss rod could have been lowered during assembly. That doesn't necessarily eliminate the possibility that this is a Spanish heel, but if it isn't, it would make it a lot easier to remove the neck. I can see that there's rosewood up there, so that's the underside of the fingerboard. We're good. The second thing I want to see is the character of the wood around the edge of the hole. Looking at the face of the block, there are torn fibers that suggest that it was drilled through from the other side. In other words, I'm looking at the side that was face down on the drill press. And as the bit exited, there was tear out. Now that couldn't happen if this block was continuous with the neck, right? So, and I can also see that the wood at the bottom of the hole is really clean and flat, and there are no drill marks on it. So I can conclude that this neck and this body began life separate from each other. The real giveaway is, of course, the fact that I can see side grain on the face of the block here. If this was a Spanish heel, that would be end grain. The other thing I can do is use a thin metal rule to measure the depth of the hole there, which turns out to be just around, I think, like 26 millimeters. And the full depth of the block is around 38 millimeters. So So the end of the block is somewhere around here. If I subtract 25 millimeters from there, I end up just in front of the 15th fret. So that would be the end of the hole. This is pretty standard actually. It's not unlike you'd find in a Martin, so that's good. I can drill my hole through the 15th fret as usual and introduce steam that way. With this gigantic hole in the front of the neck block, I'm going to have to find a way of plugging that up because I'm going to lose a lot of heat through it. So maybe a couple layers of tape or something. And other than that, we're just going to steam it off like we normally would. To do that, I need to remove the 15th fret, so I'll get some heat on it, then use the fret pulling pliers to walk across the board and take it out carefully so I can hopefully reuse it. I'll loosen the fingerboard extension up to the body joint. I have to drill 2 deep holes for my steam needle. This is why I measured, so I could hopefully hit the small gap at the end of the dovetail. That way I get access to all of the glue surfaces. I do my best to angle the guitar so that any condensation that forms will flow outside and drop off the heel rather than get into the block or possibly inside the sound box. And I try and keep things as dry as possible while I work. It doesn't take long this time before the neck comes free. I don't need to do much undercutting in this case, as that was done pretty generously the first time around. It's also a very slender heel. Looking at this, there's the better part of 1/8 of an inch worth of shims on either side in there. I probably should cut them out. Shims are not necessarily evil. They're oftentimes necessary. But this is more than I would consider usual. Okay, with both parts cleaned up, let's have a look at the starting point. This is what they saw in the factory on the day it was assembled. I have to ask why. If you're building 40 guitars a month, having tolerances this loose seems like unnecessary extra work, because it's not hard to set up jigs to get parts to fit closer than this. And a shim or two is often necessary, but the actual fitting process to get the angle right seems like it would be very uncertain, because how do I know where the center line is? I could be half an inch away. I could put the saddle over there. So I'm going to graft on some mahogany to the sides of the dovetail to get it a little closer, cut down on the time. It's my patented technique for planing thin stock like this, is holding it down while the plane's on it. And here's a pair of specialized clamping cauls which I use for this situation. It includes the dovetail angle so that there's good pressure all the way along it. I started the process of sandpaper pulling. I've explained in the past how pulling the strip all the way out removes more material at the far end of the heel than up near the fingerboard, thus tipping the neck back and improving the angle. I pretty quickly realized why there were so many shims. Look at the old outline of the heel in relation to the placement of the dovetail. Here's a normal end view of the dovetail. Its center line is perpendicular to the plane of the front of the guitar. And here's what we got. The dovetail pocket is tipped to one side. To further complicate matters, we also have this condition. From above, the pocket is canted as well. I guess the routing jig was not placed securely against the body, or a clamp slipped or something. This makes fitting interminable. Lots of testing, sanding, filing, testing, pairing, gluing more stuff to the tenon. It took hours before I got something I was happy with. I figure at the factory they gave up, cut down the dovetail, and used a lot of shims, counting on the glue to swell them up enough to lock things together securely. This is what I like to see. The straight edge now hovers gracefully just above the bridge. And yes, I did have to resort to a couple of shims of my own to make things fit perfectly. On to the tapered fingerboard wedge. I laid out the saddle location. I find this one of the strangely satisfying steps in the whole process. Then I routed the slot. I went with an 1/8 inch thick saddle rather than the 3/32 that was on the guitar previously. because it allows for slightly better intonation. There's enough width to get that B string back where it wants to be. I fit the fingerboard extension wedge and glued it in place. A little bit of squeeze out from the fish glue. Reinstalled the fret, tapped it in and used a little super glue. The area around the body joint was high and pretty lumpy, so it took some leveling. Luckily the frets were quite tall and could handle it. I recrowned the entire board actually, as the tops of the frets were very square and flat. Not all that fun. And there's all the usual polishing. The nut action was stiffer than it needed to be on some of the strings, so I amended that. I worked on the intonation and filed to the lines. Polished things up. I dialed in the action height by removing material from the bottom of the saddle. This needs to be very flat so that it mates perfectly with the slot in the bridge. It's especially important in cases where someone might want to put in an undersaddle pickup later on. You never know. Use a little pencil here and gently stroke until it's gone. And we're done. Thanks, Mr. LoPrinzi. The guitar belongs to a player who's had some issues with his fretting hand, so he prefers extra light strings. It's set up with 10 to 47s, which, you know, it has some limitations because this is a pretty big soundboard area to excite with the lower tension, but it plays very nicely. Next week we'll do this all over again with the 1946 Gibson. That should be fun.